January 2024. After 3 decades of secrecy, Kurt Cobain's official autopsy report surfaced online. The document revealed a morphine concentration so high that forensic experts called it impossible. The level found in Kurt's blood should have rendered him unconscious, incapable of holding a shotgun, much less firing it. Yet the report concluded he did exactly that. Now you will hear the part of the story no one ever truly understood. On January 24, 2024, private investigator Tom Grant posted a link on X, formerly known as Twitter. The link led to a PDF document that Grant claimed was Kurt Cobain's complete autopsy report. This is the first time this report has been made public, Grant wrote. For 30 years, Washington state laws had kept the document sealed, inaccessible to journalists, researchers, and the millions of Nirvana fans who questioned the official narrative of Kurt's death. The report was dated April 1994, just days after electrician Gary Smith discovered Kurt's body in the greenhouse room above his garage. Assistant medical examiner, Dr. Nicholas Hartshorn, had conducted the autopsy. The document contained standard information: height, weight, identifying marks, the nature of the fatal wound. But it was the toxicology section that immediately caught attention. The Chemical Toxicology Institute had analyzed Kurt's blood. The results showed a cocktail of substances: diazepam, used for treating anxiety and alcohol withdrawal; codeine, a mild opioid painkiller; nordiazepam, a muscle relaxant and anticonvulsant; and morphine, specifically 1.52 milligrams of morphine per liter of blood. That number, 1.52 milligrams, would become the center of a controversy that persists to this day. Tom Grant had been investigating Kurt's death since April 1994, when Courtney Love hired him to find her missing husband. Grant never stopped investigating after Kurt's body was discovered. For 30 years he had argued that something was wrong with the official suicide narrative. And now, with this leaked autopsy report, Grant had what he believed was proof. According to Grant, 1.52 milligrams of morphine was 3 times the lethal dose, even for a hardcore heroin addict. Grant's argument was straightforward. Kurt could not have injected himself with that much heroin and still possess the physical capability to pick up a shotgun, position it correctly, and pull the trigger. The dose would have rendered him unconscious almost immediately. Someone else must have been involved. But the science behind Grant's claim is more complicated than it appears. The controversy stems from a crucial question that the autopsy report doesn't answer. Does the 1.52 milligram figure represent a total morphine count or a free morphine count? This distinction matters enormously. When heroin enters the body, it converts to morphine. Over time, the body metabolizes morphine into various protein-bound metabolites. A total morphine test measures all morphine in the bloodstream, including these long-lived metabolites that can accumulate over days or weeks of regular heroin use. A free morphine test measures only the active, unmetabolized morphine molecules, the ones that are actually affecting the body at that specific moment. The difference between these two measurements can be massive. A chronic heroin user might have a high total morphine count from accumulated metabolites while having a relatively low free morphine count from their most recent dose. In 2002, 8 years after Kurt's death, researchers at the Forensic Science International Journal published a study specifically designed to distinguish fatal from non-fatal blood concentrations of morphine. The study found that a total morphine count of 1.52 milligrams can be survivable. In fact, the study documented a non-fatal case with a total morphine count of 2.11 milligrams in a driver who had also tested positive for other drugs. The subject remained conscious enough to attempt driving, demonstrating that functioning at levels above 1.52 milligrams is physiologically possible. However, the same study also found that the highest free morphine count from a heroin overdose survivor was only if Kurt's 1.52 milligram figure represented free morphine. That would indeed be nearly 12 times a lethal dose, a concentration so extreme that physical movement would be virtually impossible. The critical problem is that Kurt's autopsy report doesn't specify which type of test was performed. Neither Tom Grant nor anyone else has access to the original laboratory protocols that would clarify this ambiguity. The medical examiner's office has never released that information, citing Washington state privacy laws. Detective Mike Sikesinski, who reviewed Kurt's case files in 2014 as part of the Seattle Police Department's Cold Case Division, examined the toxicology reports. He was struck by the morphine levels, but ultimately concluded that the investigation had reached the correct determination of suicide. Sikesinski noted that Kurt was a known long-term heroin user with presumably high tolerance, that the toxicology results, while elevated, were not impossible for someone with Kurt's history of substance use. The methodology question extends beyond just Kurt's case. In forensic toxicology, the standard practice has evolved over time. In the 1970s, many medical examiners used total morphine counts because the test was cheaper, faster, and didn't require specialized equipment. By the 1990s, when Kurt died, some jurisdictions had shifted to free morphine testing for greater accuracy. But not all facilities had made this transition. For a known chronic drug user like Kurt, a medical examiner might reasonably choose total morphine testing. The focus would be on documenting drug use, not determining exact recent dosage. This would make the 1.52 milligram figure potentially survivable, especially for someone with Kurt's tolerance level built up over years of heroin use. Tom Grant rejects this interpretation. He argues that, regardless of testing methodology, the concentration was impossibly high. Grant points to the practical question: even if Kurt could theoretically survive that dose, could he perform the complex sequence of actions required? After injecting heroin, Kurt would have needed to pack away his syringe kit neatly, retrieve the shotgun, position it correctly, and pull the trigger. Grant insists this sequence is impossible for someone with that much heroin in their system. But there's another possibility that Grant's theory doesn't account for. Kurt might have injected himself in stages, seeking a specific level of euphoria before completing his final act. As an experienced user, Kurt would have known how to titrate his dose, injecting some heroin, waiting to feel the effects, then injecting more. This would explain both the high total morphine count and his ability to remain functional long enough to use the shotgun. The leaked autopsy report also documented other details that support the official conclusion. Detective Kosinski had noted injection marks on both of Kurt's arms. Several grams of black tar heroin were found in Kurt's drug kit, the type commonly available on the West Coast. The gun's position, the location of the spent shell, the body's position, all these elements were consistent with self-inflicted injury, according to firearms experts who examined the scene. For some people, every ambiguity becomes very strong evidence of conspiracy. For others, the evidence, even with uncertainties, points to suicide. When Tom Grant leaked the autopsy report in January 2024, media outlets attempted to verify its authenticity. TMZ contacted law enforcement, who refused to comment, citing Washington law. Without official confirmation, the document's legitimacy remained technically unverified, though its content appeared consistent with partially released information from Grant didn't reveal where he obtained the report. Given Washington's strict privacy laws around autopsy documents, the leak itself raised legal and ethical questions. Did Grant violate laws by publishing the document? Did someone in law Lawson provide it to him inappropriately? These questions remained unanswered. The timing of the leak, 30 years after Kurt's death and just months before the anniversary in April, sparked renewed debate. Fans who believed Kurt was murdered saw the morphine levels as vindication. Fans who accepted the suicide ruling viewed it as exploitation of tragedy for attention. But beyond the controversy and conspiracy theories, the leaked autopsy report reveals something important about the limitations of forensic evidence. Even with a complete toxicology report, even with detailed documentation of the death scene, fundamental questions can remain ambiguous. The difference between total morphine and free morphine, a technical detail about testing methodology, becomes the fulcrum on which entirely different narratives. For 30 years this report sat in files, inaccessible to public scrutiny. When it finally emerged, it didn't resolve the debates, It merely provided new evidence for people to interpret according to their existing beliefs. Those who thought Kurt was murdered found confirmation in the impossibly high morphine levels. Those who believed he took his own life found confirmation in the documented injection marks and drug paraphernalia. The truth, as with so much surrounding Kurt Cobain's death, remains trapped in ambiguity. Did the 1.52 milligram figure represent total morphine accumulated over time, or free morphine from a massive final dose? The autopsy report doesn't say. Did Kurt inject himself in stages, maintaining functionality long enough to complete his final act? Possible, but unproven. Could someone else have administered the dose and staged the scene? Also possible, but equally unproven. What we know for certain is limited. Kurt had high levels of morphine in his blood, he had injection marks on both arms, he had heroin in his possession. He died from a self-inflicted Rocktican wound.
Everything beyond these facts becomes interpretation, speculation, theory.
Tom Grant continues to argue that the morphine levels prove murder. Seattle police continue to classify the death as suicide, and Kurt Cobain's autopsy report, hidden for 3 decades and leaked in 2024, provides evidence that both sides used to support their conclusions. The document that was supposed to answer questions has instead generated more. And perhaps that's exactly what happens when we demand certainty from evidence that can only provide ambiguity. The number on that toxicology report, 1.52 milligrams, will be debated for another 30 years, with each side convinced they know what it truly means. The autopsy report also documented physical evidence. Kurt's body showed decomposition consistent with being deceased for approximately 3 days. The gastric contents were analyzed. Everything in the report supported the timeline, placing Kurt's death around April 5. The report confirmed Kurt died from a contact gunshot wound to the head. The shotgun was a Remington M11 20 gauge. Gunshot residue patterns were consistent with the weapon being fired at extremely close range. In 2014, Detective Secrecy examined crime scene photographs. Working with firearms experts, he reconstructed how the gun was fired. The spent shell casing position, the gun's relation to the 30, the blood patterns, all were consistent with self-inflicted injury. But Tom Grant argues this misses the crucial point. The question isn't whether Kurt physically pulled the trigger. The question is whether he could have, given the substances in his system. If the morphine levels rendered him unconscious, then someone else must have staged the scene. Grant's theory depends on interpreting that 1.52 milligrams as free morphine, which would be catastrophically high. But forensic toxicologists note that, for a long-time user like Kurt, tolerance changes everything. What would kill a novice user might merely produce euphoria in someone with years of heavy use. A 1975 study found that morphine blood levels alone were meaningless for determining cause of death. Users who died from other causes actually averaged slightly higher morphine levels than overdose victims. The study concluded morphine in blood simply indicates recent drug use, not whether the dose was fatal. This complicates Grant's argument. Even if Kurt's morphine level was high, it doesn't prove incapacitation. For a chronic user, that level might have produced intoxication, but not unconsciousness. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer reported on April 14, 1994, that Kurt was high on heroin when he pulled the trigger. Law enforcement believed the evidence showed Kurt had injected heroin shortly before his death. The morphine level indicated recent heroin use, but didn't preclude the physical ability to handle a firearm. The leaked autopsy report documented additional substances, diazepam and nordiazepam, both benzodiazepines, were present. These drugs enhance morphine's effects. Some argue this combination would have made incapacitation more likely. Others note that for a polysubstance user like Kurt, this combination might have been typical. What the autopsy report cannot tell us is Kurt's exact mental state and physical capability in his final moments. The numbers document what was in his blood. They don't document whether he was conscious, how impaired he was, whether his hands were steady. Tom Grant believes the morphine level proves someone else was involved. He has spent 30 years investigating based on this conviction. He has consulted with medical experts who support his view that the dose was incapacitating. The Seattle Police Department maintains that all evidence points to suicide. After multiple reviews, including the thorough 2014 cold case examination, they conclude the toxicology results don't preclude self-inflicted injury. When the autopsy report leaked in January 2024, it didn't change these positions. Those convinced of murder found new evidence in the morphine levels. Those convinced of suicide found confirmation in the documented Dunkerman evidence. Perhaps the most significant aspect isn't what the report reveals, but what it obscures. By focusing on one ambiguous number, the morphine level, attention has been distracted from broader questions about Kurt's final days. What happened in the 72 hours before his death? Who saw him last? What was his mental state? The autopsy report, hidden for 30 years and finally leaked, was supposed to be the definitive document. Instead, it became another contested piece of evidence, and maybe that's the real lesson. Sometimes the documents we think will provide answers only generate more questions. Sometimes the truth remains hidden not because documents are sealed, but because the evidence itself is ambiguous.